Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the first installment of our summer CLE series. We are really excited to partner with DRTX, Disability Rights Texas, for our first session of the series. And we're going to go into the presentation and then give you a little bit of an introduction into what our orgs do. But my name is Veronica Warms. I'm the policy attorney for the Voting Rights Department of the Texas Civil Rights Project. And my awesome colleague Sashi is with Disability Rights Texas. You want to?
Hi everyone. I'm Sashi Nisankaral, and on the voting rights team at DRTX. Happy to be here. Do you want me to go into a little bit about what DRTX is?
In 1 second, Sashi. I'm just
Okay.
gonna, can everyone see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes.
Beautiful. Love it. All right, so first, Texas Civil Rights Project. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization founded in 1990. We have 3 programs, one of which is voting rights, and we work in legal and advocacy issues to protect the right to vote in Texas. We try to support in every single area of the voting process, from digital support all the way up to litigation as needed. And Sashi, if you want to go into Disability Rights Texas.
Yes. So DRTX is a federally designated protection and advocacy agency, or PNA. And each state and territory has their own federally designated PNA. And what that means is that we act on behalf of clients with disabilities, and we have so many different issue teams that work on different aspects of disability law and disability rights law. So we have housing and transportation, education, a lot, so many. And one of those teams happens to be the voting rights team, which is the one that I'm on. And so what we do is we will file DOJ complaints if we find that there are any violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act or HAVA, which is the Help America Vote Act, different laws protecting voters with disabilities, and then even Texas law as well. And that also includes litigation if needed.
Awesome. So we're really blessed to have Sashi with us today as our guest of honor on this awesome CLE that we're doing. So roadmap for the presentation. We're legal professionals, love a roadmap, so here we go. We're going to first go over the history of discrimination against folks with disabilities in the law. Then we're going to go into the development of federal protections in the law for people with disabilities, go into the Texas protections that are in Texas law for voters with disabilities. Next, we're going to go into some legislation that actually improves access for voters with disabilities. Then my colleague Sashi is going to go into the Disability Rights Texas primer on disability law. And finally, we'll have some time for a question and answer session. So first, the history of discrimination. So there's a history of provisions that have been designed to disenfranchise voters with, and this is a direct quote from the statutes, mental incapacity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Many state constitutions strip the right to vote away from citizens who are deemed to have mental incapacity. And Texas is one of these states. It prohibits, quote, persons who have been determined mentally incompetent by a court, end quote, from voting, which is in the Texas Constitution. And examples of this statutory discrimination exist even into the modern day. So as of 2020, there were 10 states that denied the right to vote using stigmatizing terms like idiots, insane persons, non compos mentis, or in English, unsound mind. 13 states bar individuals under guardianship which generally finds or requires a judicial finding of mental incapacity or mental incompetence. And 22 states, including Texas, bar voting only if a court has determined that an individual specifically lacks the capacity to vote. So these issues are still prescient for voters who experience a disability. And we're going to go into how federal law has developed some protections over the years. So it's been a long road to enfranchisement for the vast majority of the population in America, and no less so than for people with disabilities in America. So the timeline to enfranchisement started in 1789. At this time, states limited voting rights to property owning and or tax-paying white men. In 1870, this was expanded with the 15th Amendment, which provided the right to vote on the ground of race or color. In 1920, we got the development of the 19th Amendment, which provided the right to vote to women. In 1924, we got the Indian Citizenship Act, which provided both citizenship and the right to vote to Indigenous people. And in 1965, we get the first federal law that specifically protects the right to vote for folks with disabilities. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 provided voters with disabilities the ability to receive assistance from the person of their choice. And that remains law to this day. In 1973, we had the Rehabilitation Act, which prohibited federal agencies from discriminating on the basis of disability in federally administered programs. In 1984, we got the Voting Accessibility for Elderly and Handicapped Act, which required accessible polling places in federal elections or an alternate means of voting on election day, which is a very important step forward. In 1990, we got the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, that most people are familiar with, at least in name only. And it provides protection to voters with disabilities from discrimination by public entities to make sure that people with disabilities have the full and equal opportunity to vote. In 1993, we got the National Voter Registration Act, or the NVRA, which requires all offices that provide public assistance or state-funded programs to provide the opportunity to register to vote in federal elections. And 2002, we have the Help America Vote Act, or as my colleague mentioned earlier, HAVA, which requires at least one accessible voting system for people with disabilities at each polling place for federal elections, which is a very important development in the law. So those are the baseline federal protections that are available to all people with disabilities in the United States. We're now going to go into the Texas-specific protections for voters with disabilities. And we've broken this into a few buckets. First, we're going to go over the protections that are in place for voters that need additional mobility access or mobility assistance. Then we're going to go into the assistance provisions and exactly what assistance constitutes and means. Third, we're going to go into accessible technology and what that looks like. And finally, we're going to go into the mechanism of the late ballot and how that can be used by voters with disabilities at the last minute. All right, so mobility access. So there are certain requirements that polling places need to meet in order to comply with Texas law. And according to the Texas Election Code, every polling place in Texas must be accessible to the elderly and to people with disabilities. What does that mean, though? So to be considered accessible, a polling place has to be on the ground level or accessible via an elevator that opens at least 36 inches wide. All the entrances and or exits to the polling place have to be at least 32 inches wide. Curbs near the entrance must have curb cuts or temporary non-slip ramps. Stairs must have handrails and a non-slip ramp that must be available. And it must not have a barrier that would keep voters with disabilities from the voting station. Additional requirements are that the Commissioner's Court for the county has to provide an accessible polling place in every single precinct. The entity that's holding an election, and the reason for that more general language is that during a primary election is the political party that is responsible for administering the election, and as opposed to a regular election where the county would be responsible. But that entity has to comply with the accessibility requirements in the election code if they elect not to use a county chosen accessible polling place. So if they choose another polling place out of left field, they have to ensure that it complies with the accessibility requirements in the Texas election code. They don't get a free pass for that. The Secretary of State must also approve a political party's rejection of an available county designated polling place. And these polling places must also comply with disability protections under federal law, which we went over. Now, when we talk about mobility, access, and voting, curbside voting is a really important innovation that's happened. And it allows a voter who is, quote, physically unable to enter the polling place without personal assistance or the likelihood of injuring the voter's health on their request to get an election officer to actually deliver the ballot to the voter at the polling place entrance or the curb. This is a great tool for voters who have any kind of mobility issue. And allows for the technology to actually be brought to the voter. At each polling place, an area for parking not smaller than the size of one parking space shall be reserved for voting under this section, and the area may not be designated specifically for persons with disabilities. So, for instance, a quote-unquote designated parking spot for people with disabilities that doesn't have the actual curbside voting sign that we'll get into on the next slide, that doesn't count. It has to actually be marked a curbside voting spot in order to count for the sake of the election code, which is an important distinction. So this is what the signs tend to look like. And the sign has to be indicating that the place is reserved for use by a voter who is unable to enter the polling place. And it has to display in large font that is clearly readable from a vehicle, very important, a telephone number that a voter may call or text to request assistance from an election officer at the polling place. But what if a voter doesn't have the ability to call the number or needs a different method of communication? So the election code also provides for the option, and indeed we've heard from our election protection hotline that a lot of voters with disabilities prefer this option of having a parking space that has a button or intercom that allows the voter to request assistance from the election officer. And this makes sense, right? If you're a voter who has any kind of hearing disability or have trouble communicating verbally or what have you, having that option of just pushing a button can be preferable. So luckily the election code is providing for that option as well. Okay, so what if you want to vote from home as a person with a disability? So voting by mail is available in Texas. However, we are an excuse-only state. What does that mean? It means that if you are a voter in Texas and you want to vote by mail, you have to fall into one of these quote-unquote excuses. Excuse me. You have to fall into one of these quote unquote excuses. So a qualified voter in Texas is allowed to vote if they are allowed to vote by mail if they are going to be away from their county on election day and early voting, if they're sick or have a disability. And what this means specifically now is to have a sickness or physical condition that prevents the voter from appearing at the polling place on election day without a likelihood of needing personal assistance or of injuring a voter's health. Why is this an important distinction? So before the COVID-19 pandemic, the election code said sickness or disability, and it was relatively broad. And it was up to a voter's discretion to determine whether their sickness or disability would prevent them from voting in person and whether they could utilize the vote by mail option. There were a number of lawsuits that were filed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, trying to expand the sickness or disability provision to include people who would suffer from contracting COVID-19 in the polling place. The Texas Supreme Court resoundingly rejected that, unfortunately, and the Texas legislature, in order for there to be complete clarity on this point, I suppose, wrote it into the law that that is exactly what a sickness or disability means, and that so that it couldn't be more generally construed. Other excuses are being 65 years of age or older on election day, being confined in jail but still eligible to vote, or be expecting to give birth within 3 weeks before or after election day. That was another narrowing. Previously, it just required being pregnant. Additionally, the voter has to affirmatively attest that they suffer from a disability on their application to vote by mail in order to claim this exception. And the election code specifically states that the following are not exceptions that allow you to vote by mail: lack of transportation, a sickness that doesn't prevent the voter from appearing at the polling place on election day without a likelihood of needing personal assistance or injuring the voter's health, or the fact that a voter needs to appear that day at their place of employment. So unfortunately, in the election code, those are not covered. Now, moving on to assistance, we're going to go over the vote by mail context with assistance first, and then go into in person. So in general, a voter is eligible for assistance if the voter cannot read or prepare the ballot because of a physical disability that renders the voter unable to write or see, or an inability to read the language in which the ballot was written. And a voter can be assisted by any person of their choice, once again, unless they are the voter's employer or their union representative. Important caveat. But a voter can also select an interpreter to communicate with election officials, and it can be any person of their choice. But if they don't have an interpreter, then they can use one that's been appointed by the county. Now, assistance in the voting by mail context includes doing any of the following things in the presence of the voter's ballot or carrier envelope. And that's reading the ballot to the voter, directing the voter to read the ballot, marking the voter's ballot, or directing the voter to mark the ballot. And additionally, an ink on paper signature is required from the assistant on the reverse side of the carrier envelope, along with the assistant's name and residential address. So an electronic signature is not sufficient under this part of the election code. For in-person voting, there is an additional requirement that if the voter is being assisted by anybody who isn't an election official while preparing the ballot, then the assister has to take an oath on penalty of perjury. The text of the oath is below. This provision was added by SB 1, which was an omnibus anti-voter piece of legislation that was implemented in or that passed in the 2021 special session. It made numerous changes to the law, but one of them was this oath of assistance. And it's concerning because a lot of people with disabilities had assistants who were concerned about their liability if they took this oath. So it's been part of lawsuits and what have you, but it is still a current requirement to take the oath of assistance under penalty of perjury before you can assist someone with voting. Okay, now we're going to get into accessible technology. So, electronic voting is an option for uh, federal military overseas folks. So, the Federal Military and Overseas Voters Empowerment Act passed in 2009, and it requires states to enable the electronic delivery of blank absentee ballots to voters who fall under the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, UOC AVA. Try saying that 4 times fast. And this is relevant because the system has been in place since 2009. Our armed forces overseas use this method partially when they're stationed in areas that don't have reliable mail coverage. It allows them to use this electronic method of voting to ensure that their ballot is safely counted. Now, 12 states currently allow voters with disabilities to use this very reliable system to vote. Unfortunately, Texas is not one of them statewide. However, there is an interesting case of Johnson v. Callennan, which happened in Bexar County. For those who are unfamiliar with Texas counties, that's where San Antonio is located. And in this case, 3 visually impaired plaintiffs and 2 disability rights organizations sued under the ADA under the theory that both paper ballots and mail-in ballots impaired ballot secrecy for these voters, which makes sense, right? If you're a visually impaired voter and your only option to cast a ballot is to use paper or mail-in ballots, then you need to use an assistant, and therefore your ballot isn't completely secret, right? Because they're going to know your selections, etc. So this resulted in a permanent injunction that allowed visually impaired voters to use this UOC AVA system to vote. And therefore, that allowed them to use screen reader technology and gave them the ability to have a secret ballot. So this was a really important win, and part of Bexar County to this day can use access to this system to make their vote both secret and accessible to them, hoping that such a thing will be expanded later, but it's an important win, at least at the local level. Okay, next we're going to go into late ballots. What is a late ballot? So if a voter is eligible for the disability exception to vote by mail, and their disability started on or after the day before the last day a mail-in ballot application can be submitted, then they can submit a late ballot. So let's break that down for a second. If you suffer something, either an accident or worsening of your condition or what have you, that would make you qualify for the disability exception to vote by mail, but it started after you could technically apply to vote by mail, then you can use this mechanism to cast a ballot that counts. So the application that you submit for the late ballot has to include the same information that's required on the mail-in ballot application form, and it has to be certified or accompanied by the certification of a licensed physician, chiropractor, or Christian Science practitioner. The application also has to be submitted in person to the early voting clerk by the voter with a disabilities representative, either during early voting or by 5 p.m. on election day. Now, it is important to note that because a medical professional's signature is required for this document, and that can require a lot of footwork, it's usually recommended for voters who plan to be hospitalized or are currently hospitalized during early voting or on election day. And it's been the experience of Disability Rights Texas that this option or solution comes from voters who are needing very last minute solutions. So as a general rule, if a person knows that they are going to be confined and not able to vote in person, then applying for a ballot by mail is still the best option. but otherwise, this is a good option if the unforeseen happens too close to Election Day. All right, so now we're going to talk about legislation that actually improves access to the ballot for voters with disabilities. SB 477 passed this most recent session, and it actually expanded several areas of voter access for folks with disabilities. So the first provision requires curbside signage for every polling place in Texas and standardized what must be included on that sign. And just to give you a little bit of background on why this provision was necessary, during the 2022 midterms at the Election Protection Program, we had a ton of our legal volunteers call every single county in Texas and ask how someone could access their curbside voting. We got a myriad of different answers, let me tell you. Everything from, there's a sign out front to, oh, you have to call this number, it's on our website. And my favorite from Loving County, one of the smaller counties in Texas, where the election official said, oh, all you have to do is honk twice outside the elections office and someone will come out and help you with curbside voting. Whether or not that's a valid method of requesting curbside voting is completely up for debate, but it's certainly not useful if you don't know that that's what you have to do in order to get the curbside voting option. So at the Texas legislature, we presented that information to the Senate State Affairs Committee, and we presented that in the House Elections Committee as well, and lobbied in support of this bill. And I'm glad to say that it is now law, and you now have to have one of those signs in front of every curbside voting place, polling place in Texas. So great win, and really glad that we don't have to rely on honking anymore without, without notice. Further, another thing that was in the bill was that a election official has to allow voters with disabilities to get ahead in line if needed. This is the voter priority protocol, which has been really helpful for folks that can't stand for long periods of time. And we're really happy to see that become law. Finally, it requires the Secretary of State to create a fillable mail-in ballot application form that can be printed directly from the website. And this can be helpful for people who have difficulties writing, etc. So there is actually some good news in Texas election law on the access front for people with disabilities. And next, I'm going to turn it over to Sashi for the next part of today's presentation.
Awesome. Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you.
All right, awesome. Cool. Okay. All right. So kind of switching gears a little bit and continuing to talk about voting assistance and specifically the litigation around it. If anyone is familiar with Senate Bill 1, it passed in 2022, and it was an omnibus bill, like Veronica mentioned, dealing with a lot of election issues, one of which happened to be providing assistance to voters in person. And so in 2022 July, parts of that bill were struck down in that Texas could not limit the kind of assistance that somebody provided to merely just directing someone to mark the ballot or marking the ballot or reading the ballot like that. Because if you think about it, under federal law, like under the Americans with Disabilities Act and under HAVA and the Voting Rights Act, assistance can be a lot of different things, right? So it could be directing somebody through the polling location, offering them a chair to sit down if they can't stand for long periods of time. So assistance it has to be based on the individual needing that assistance, and to limit it to the scope that Texas did, the court found was impermissible. And this goes back to an injunction that was in place since 2018. So this was nothing new at the time in 2022. Next slide, please. All right. A second. Sorry about that. My computer is catching up. So then next we're talking about reasonable accommodations. Now, I think a lot of people have heard this term before, reasonable accommodations in different contexts. But what we want to be clear about in the voting context, and especially in the Texas Election Code, is that none of the provisions in the Texas Election Code would prohibit a qualified individual from requesting either reasonable accommodation or a reasonable modification to a policy. So most people, when they think of accommodations, they're thinking of, like what I had mentioned in the previous slide, like asking for a chair or asking somebody to help you fill out a form or something at a polling location. But you also have to consider modifying policies that are in place that can allow a qualified individual or somebody that's associated with them to access various parts of the voting program that a county offers. So that's another thing to keep in mind that is specifically enumerated in Texas law. Next slide. All right. So, sorry. Okay. I'm sorry, Veronica, my computer's like glitching. Okay, so now we're talking about permanent photo ID exemption. This is for people that one of two ways that they've been determined either by the Social Security Administration or by Veterans Affairs that they have a disability, right? And then that they are unable to secure or to get one of the acceptable forms of ID, which there are a handful of them per the Texas Election Code. And once they present documentation from either the SSA or from the VA and a statement to their county officials, they would be permanently exempt from having to present this photo ID when they go and vote at their polling location. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're kind of back on architectural barriers and architectural compliance at the polling location. We get a lot of counties and jurisdictions in general that they'll be having elections in their areas and in their local buildings, whether it is in a school or in a library or in a church. And we want to make sure that they have like a centralized place that they can go and kind of check off, like, what are the things that are working, that are compliant, and then what are some of the features of this building that are not compliant, and can we remedy them by using temporary remedies? And so the Department of Justice has put out this really great ADA checklist for voting locations. And what's unique about it is that it's not meant to be a comprehensive checklist, right? Because if you were to go to any of these buildings, like if you were to go to a library just to spend the day researching or to write something, you are accessing that building in a way that is different from somebody that is voting at that location. So the voter has a much more targeted path and doesn't interact with the building at large. And so you're not going to find bathroom and toilet room components of the voter checklist, of the polling place checklist. What you will find is public sidewalks. You're going to find parking lots, parking spaces to see if they're enough accessible and van accessible parking spaces. You're going to be looking at the width of the walkways. You're going to be looking at slopes for ramps and things like that, right? So you're basically trying to put yourself in the shoes of a voter and like how they would access, which entrance they would use to get inside and then to the voting room. And then once you get into the voting room, you're going to want to know, like what is their path of travel in the voting room? Where are they going to access the voting machines? And then in Texas specifically, the scans, right? Like where are you dropping your ballot once you cast it? And then how are you leaving the room and going back out? So that all gets mapped out. And that's how this checklist, even though it's not inclusive of all the different architectural elements that a building can have, it's really, really detailed. And so it is a great way for all jurisdictions, whether they're small or large, to evaluate the accessibility of a potential location that they're going to use, or one that they have been using that maybe people are interested in how to make it accessible, at least during voting time. One thing that I did want to mention is I know a lot of times we see churches used as polling locations. Churches are specifically exempt from the ADA. And religious institutions in general are exempt from the ADA. But what brings them into the fold when it comes to voting and elections is that you have a local government agency that is hosting an election at a church. So at least during the time that voting is occurring there, the church has to be temporarily compliant and accessible to voters and to people that are going to be accessing that location during the election. Next slide. All right. Sorry about that. Once again, the same glitches in my computer. Okay, so now we want to talk about CMS, which is Center for Medicaid Services. And what we want to get from the guidance that CMS recently issued is that places like residential facilities like nursing homes and assisted living facilities that are supported by CMS can't prohibit any voter registration activity. They can't take actions that would restrict their residents from being able to participate in the voting process. So a lot of times, what you'll see is the employees that work at these kinds of facilities end up being assisters to voters that need assistance, either on their mail ballot application or their actual ballot in marking the ballot, or sending it back or dropping it off. A lot of times, like you'll see, these employees take residents in groups to go in person and vote and be the assister there as well. And so I think that's like the practical way that you see this happening. But this is important because I don't think we think a lot of times about folks that live in these assisted living facilities, but it's a huge population of people that greatly are involved in the process, either through mail-in ballots or curbside is really popular among this group of voters, and then certainly in person as well. Next slide. All right, cool. So I guess we open it up to
questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now here's the fun part where you get to quiz us on any questions that came up during the presentation. Yeah, we're at your disposal.
I don't know if we had anything in the chat already, but
I did not see anything.
No, we don't have any questions in the chat.
All right. So if anybody has any questions, going once. Going twice. All right. Well, with that in mind, I really want to thank you all for joining us this evening. As we said, we are going to have a summer CLE series for um, every Tuesday for the next few Tuesdays. This is the first one, but my colleague Carl will be doing two CLE sessions on the post-elections process and one on language assistance. And we're really excited for those as well. I really want to thank everybody for coming and for joining us on an evening and yeah, learning about this important issue with us. Also want to plug that election season is looming. It's part of why we're doing this series. And TCRP and Disability Rights Texas are both part of the Election Protection Coalition. And we are there to help voters who run into any legal problems at the polls. And Disability Rights Texas has a specific hotline number that folks can call if they're experiencing any issues related to disability access at the polls. So if you're interested in helping out with that, please stay tuned as we will be happy to blast you with information that we collected from your submission of signing up for this CLE. And yeah, thanks for joining us. Now, the part that everyone's been waiting for, who needs CLE credit, the CLE number. But yeah, I think that we're good to hang on for another few minutes if folks need to jot down the number and if any questions have occurred to folks, please shout.
I did want to mention something because you had brought it up, the Johnson and the Johnson v. Callanan case
Yeah.
in county. So, you know, they're under a court order and will be for the next 3 years. So the more we can do to promote that program to individuals who are blind or have vision impairments in San Antonio, in the Bexar County area, because I think there could be work done in terms of like educating the public on like this program being available to them. So please help spread the word that that they can use the omni ballot system in Bexar County to receive their ballot electronically.
100%. Completely echo that. And yeah, maybe we can shout it at the Texas legislature as well, Sashi, to see if they'll expand that to not just Bexar County, but all of Texas.
So. It got all the way up to the governor's desk and that was vetoed. So we'll try again.
Here we go. Round 2. I'm ready if you are, Sashi.
Yeah, I am.
All right. Well, we'll hang out for a few more minutes, but thank you guys for coming here. And I'll pause the recording if anyone has any questions. No worries. Otherwise, I'll leave the CLE credit number up for a sec just to make sure that folks had a chance to jot it down.
Thanks, Veronica, for doing this with me. It was fun.
Of course. Been a blast. All right, let's stop recording.